Now we're going to hear from Irene Lanzinger, who's a longtime union activist and teacher. She began her teaching career in 1978 and taught in Abbotsford and Vancouver. She's traveled overseas and taught in Japan and Saudi Arabia. She's been active in the BC Teachers Federation, serving as president of the Vancouver Secondary Teachers Association and as a negotiator on provincial bargaining teams and vice president and president of the BCTF. Irene served as an officer of the BC Federation of Labour from 2007-2010 and was elected to the position of Secretary-Treasurer to the BC Federation of Labour in 2010. She's the first teacher to assume a top post in the Provincial Federation of Labour. Irene?
Thank you, Linda. I want to talk about our particular experience in British Columbia with what I think is a cookie-cutter neoliberal government. And of course, I think it probably won't surprise you that I'm going to tell you the story of teachers and teachers' battle with that government. It was really not only teachers' battle, it was really a battle of the labor movement because teachers had tremendous support from other unions in that battle. But let me first tell you why I say that the BC Liberal government is a cookie-cutter neoliberal austerity government. They were elected in May of 2001, the day after they were elected. And we forget this. It amazes me that we forget this. The day after they were elected, they introduced an across-the-board 25% cut in income taxes. And that has resulted in billions and billions of dollars in lost revenue in this province. They cut the corporate tax rate from 16.5% to 10%. They abolished the corporate capital tax. They cut the small business tax from 4.5% to 2.5% and raised the threshold at which it was charged. And so in addition to the income tax cut, that has just been a massive, massive loss, billions of dollars in provincial government revenue. Just imagine what we could do to fight homelessness, to fund education and health care, to provide housing in this province if we had those billions of dollars. They created the crisis, and they used that crisis to trample on rights, to cut public services, and to introduce these austerity measures. And if you're going to introduce austerity measures, I argue you have to attack unions. It's absolutely required that you attack unions because unions have rights, they fight for those rights, they raise wages and benefits, and they lift the boats for everyone, right? So you have to attack unions. They were elected in May, and Gordon Campbell was premier. He did a Christmas interview. And in that Christmas interview, he identified 3 unions in particular that were problems. One was the BC Teachers Federation. The second was the Hospital Employees Union. And those of you from British Columbia know what happened to those 2 unions over the 11 years of the Liberal government. And the third, and I don't want to really talk about this one so much, was the BC Nurses Union. Interestingly enough, and if we have a drink later on, I'll tell you what's happened with the nurses, but they're no longer in the Fed. They're raiding the Hospital Employees Union. It was the Campbell government trying to split the union movement, and he got the nurses, right? So, but the BCTF and the HEU have had long battles, as many unions in this province have had. So there was a calculated attack on rights, an aggressive agenda of privatization and deregulation. Now children, and I have to mention this one, children as young as 12 in this province can work with virtually no regulation. Remember, he changed child labor laws, one of the first things they did. And we have the worst child labor protection anywhere in North America now in British Columbia. So this was the agenda of this government. It was an aggressive agenda introduced immediately. So the Liberals were elected in May, and they have maybe called the legislature together maybe once in the fall in their entire time. I can't remember, very rarely. Almost never have a fall sitting of the legislature. They were elected in May. In July, they brought the legislature back to introduce essential services legislation that limited, virtually destroyed teachers' right to strike. We were in bargaining at the time, and we always have an action plan at the BCTF. We had phase 1 and phase 2. And phase 1 was withdrawal of supervision, report cards, that kind of thing. And phase 2 was a full-out strike. So we went to the Labor Board under the rules of essential services in the fall, and we got an order from the Labor Board that we could not do report cards, which nobody really seemed to care. That was always kind of interesting to me. We didn't do report cards. We stopped supervising the playground. We stopped going to staff meetings. We were teaching. Kids were learning. It was all going ahead. And when I was writing this, I remembered a Krieger cartoon at the time. And those of you from BC may remember that David Chignovsky was the president of BCTF at the time. Kind of a, well, you know, I'm pretty tall, so I describe him as the short guy. Describe almost everybody that way, except my son, who's really tall. And bearded, you know David. And Krieger had this cartoon where he had phase 1, and it was David, this great cartoon of David, waving a BCTF flag, you know, a big smile on his face. And then phase 2 was a great big boot with BC Liberals written on it, and a little BCTF flag coming out from underneath, you know, with it squashed, right? And indeed, that's kind of what happened in 2001, 2002. Because we were on this partial job action in January, we were all set to vote on going to phase 2, and in the midst of that, the Liberal government introduced Bill 27, 28, and 29, in which they stripped out every piece of class size language, protection for students with special needs, things we had bargained over a 30-year history of the BCTF. We had been working on that language. We had, according to the employer, some of the best language on class size and composition in North America, maybe the world. We didn't think it was perfect. We thought we had lots of work to do, but we had very good protections in class size and for students with special needs in most districts in the province. I was one of the chief negotiators for the Federation at the time, and we went to the table, and the employer said to us, you know, the problem with your class size language is that it drives funding to the classroom. That was what was said to us at the bargaining table. And of course, you know, that was BC Public School Employers Association, very close to the Liberals, and the Liberals took care of that for them and stripped all that language out of the collective agreement. Binders and binders and binders, stacks, because it was much of it was locally bargained language, stacks and stacks of provisions from collective agreements stripped out in one piece of legislation. But the Liberals did something almost worse than that. And it's funny for me to say this, but in that same piece of legislation, they imposed a 7.5% salary increase for teachers that they did not fund. And so the message to school boards was, raise class sizes to pay teachers. And so that's what happened. We lost 2,000 teachers, and school boards lost huge amounts of funding, but they had the flexibility to deal with that because they no longer had to meet class size limits. We had a one-day walkout, a one-day strike, and we went back to work, and we started to plan. And we started to talk to our members. I remember this specifically because we would go out to local meetings. That inspired me to run for office. I went on to be vice president, president of BCTF through the whole time that the Liberals, well, 9 of the 11 years that the Liberals have been in power, I was a full-time officer at the BCTF. So we began to talk to our members. And one of the questions we asked them is, what are we going to do if the Liberals do this again next time we bargain? Like, what are we going to do if they bring in legislation again? And our members, by and large, said, we're going to defy that legislation. We have to start talking about and planning defying legislation if they bring it in again. So we had our lawyers, you know, we had our warnings, you know, you'll be in contempt of court, you could be thrown in jail, you could be fined, you could be this, you could be that. You know, never talk to lawyers about that stuff is my advice, really. Though I have to tell you, well, maybe, our lawyers changed over the course of this. They sort of started to modify their advice as, you know, all the stuff didn't always come true. But so anyway, we talked to our members again and again about this. And we went back into bargaining in 2004. And virtually all of the public sector was bargaining at the time, right? And they all kind of settled with 0 and 0, I think. It was one of those 0 and 0 years. And we were going into this bargaining, and we went into September of 2005, the next round of bargaining. We bargained for more than a year. I was on the team again. And we ended up with a phase 1 and phase 2. And we were in phase 1 in September. We had a legal strike and vote in September, 90-some%. And we said to our members, if there's legislation, we have a legislative response plan. And our plan is that if there's legislation, there'll be a meeting of the executive. They will be, the executive will make a recommendation to you, and you'll get to vote again, right? So, the Liberals walked right into it, right? We had our legal strike vote in September. We were on this partial job action, everybody teaching, and they brought in and imposed another collective agreement. And it was just 0 and 0 this time, no strips to the agreement, though we hadn't gotten anything back. They introduced the legislation on Monday. The executive committee met that night, and we recommended to our members that we go out on strike on Friday, that we defy the legislation. And we had votes of our members on Tuesday and Wednesday, and we had a higher strike vote for what we knew was going to be an illegal action than we had had for the legal action. It was, sort of 89 and 91. They were pretty close. So legislation passes. BCPC goes to the Labor Board on Thursday and has our strike declared illegal before we go out. That's the Labor Board in this province, right? So before you even walk out, your strike's illegal. But our members had voted, they knew the consequences, they had the legal advice, and on Friday of that week, we engaged in an illegal strike. And the lawyers were telling us, they're going to take your houses away, you're going to get fined, you're going to be put in jail. They'll take away your building because the fines will be so high. John Rogers, one of the best labor lawyers in this province, said to me, Irene, you can't win a fight with government. You better go back to work. You're in contempt of court. And on Sunday, we were ruled in contempt of court because we had defied this order that said the strike was illegal. Employer goes to the Labor Board, or goes to the courts and enforces the order from the Labor Board. We're in contempt on Sunday. But we got this bankruptcy judge. I don't know if those of you in the province remember this, and she kind of came to this. So she ruled us in contempt on Sunday, but said, I'm not going to do anything to say what the penalty for this contempt is until Thursday, right? So there we are out merrily on our picket lines. The Fed is starting to talk about, the BC Fed is starting to talk about how they're going to support us. The officers are meeting, we're picketing, people are in pretty good spirits, and the lawyers are just so nervous that they had the worst time. On Thursday, the judge comes back and she says, well, it's an illegal strike, so my penalty is that the BCTF can't spend any money on the strike. And so you can't pay strike pay, right? We have $50 a day strike pay. You can't pay strike pay. And I want to read you what Michael Smith wrote in the province the next morning. He's a self-described muckraker in the political scene in BC. He said, broke and demoralized teachers crossing picket lines to return to work will have a withering effect on the union's resolve. So the next morning, we get up, we go to the strike, people know they're not going to get picket pay, and the media streams out to the picket lines to talk to our members. And they go to a teacher in Burnaby North, math teacher, a young teacher named Natasha. Put a microphone in her face and they say, how do you feel about your union taking you out on this strike and now you're not going to get strike pay? And she looked at him and she said, and this made global, I voted to go on the strike. I am the BCTF. you know, they would interview other teachers, and the teachers would hold up a math book and say, look, I'm teaching from this 10-year-old math book. I haven't had a new math book for 10 years. It's about time the government started funding education. And I remember, you know, we were working 20-hour days. The leadership of the union were just about dead. I remember thinking, when did we give every one of our members media training? Like, how did that happen? But of course, by 2005, people were so fed up. They'd lost class sizes, they'd lost support for kids, they'd lost teaching assistants, you know, everybody was struggling. Teachers were fed up, and they were ready for this fight. So we went into the second week of that strike. We had tremendous support from unions, other unions, and I'll get to that, you know, but before our strike, there had been a battle with Crown prosecutors, and they get an arbitrated agreement, and the government had decided not to honor their arbitrated agreement and give them the increase that they were entitled to under this arbitration process. And so on the second week of the strike, Monday or Tuesday, I'm driving to some picket line, and I got CBC radio on, and I hear this news release from the Crown prosecutors. And the Crown prosecutors say, if there's any legal action against any teachers or any leaders of the BCTF, they could not handle that prosecution because they would be in a conflict of interest. Because the same thing had been done to them by the government, right? The government had legislated something on them that wasn't fair, right? And I thought to myself, my God, if you're a union leader and the Crown prosecutors are on your side, you're in good shape, right? So there were some moments in that strike. We had parents, of course, we had tremendous community support, and it built over the course of the 2 weeks. We had more and more and more support in this province from parents, from communities, and from other unions who put their jobs and their money on the line for us. Cup W, John Bale's here. They were, you know, fined, they were disciplined, people were fired. We got them reinstated in most cases, in all cases, I think. But we had mines out. We had the second week of the strike, mines went out, mills went out, the postal workers went out, the bus drivers went out. We had hotels picketed in Victoria. We had enormous support from the labor movement. And it was a real show of strength of the BC Federation of Labor to support teachers. Wonderful thing. Now, eventually, we had Vince Reddy brought in. We had a mediated deal. We got a promise of class-size legislation. Long story, never ended up being very good and never replaced what we had lost. We got money for salary harmonization for a long-term disability plan, and our members voted in favor of that, and we went back to work after a 2-week illegal strike. After the strike was over, we were fined $500,000 for that strike. One of the biggest fines ever launched, laid against a union for an illegal activity. But the BCTF has a $30 million budget, so from my point of view, $500,000 is a pretty good deal. And the best thing about the $500,000, I'd never been fined for anything illegal before, so I didn't know this, is that you get to give it to charity. The $500,000 goes to charity. So I don't know, I didn't know that rule before, but so we got to pick these. The bad thing about the charities was that the employer had to agree on the charities, right? So we had all kinds of great left-wing organizations that we were going to give it to, revolutionary kind of organizations, and the employer wouldn't agree. So a lot of that money went to the United Way, very fine organization, but you know, we got to give the $500,000 to charity. So it was a great thing, and I want to tell you this. The Liberals continued to attack teachers after that. They imposed an agreement this year as well, right? You remember in the beginning of this year. Now, BCTF eventually settled that. A mediator was appointed again. It was not, and it was stripping again. And this time, it was stripping posting and filling and seniority language in the collective agreement, so they could sort of, you know, go around any kind of rules on who gets hired. So they didn't really. They never really stopped, but they backed up a lot after that. And we did get class-size legislation, which they introduced legislation later that removed it. The one other thing I want to say is that the Hospital Employees Union they had their contracting out language stripped out of their agreement, their wages cut by 15%. So Campbell was true to his word at attacking 2 of the 3 unions he mentioned and splitting the 3rd one off. But the HEU won their court case on their bill, and eventually the language that stripped our agreement, the BCTF agreement, was found to be unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. And so the remedy is still in legal dispute, so we haven't got all the language back. The BCTF hasn't got all the language back, but the law that stripped the agreement was eventually found to be unconstitutional. I want to just end, yesterday I was on a panel with Michael Smith, the guy who predicted that our members would all go in when we couldn't pay them strike pay, and was wrong about that. He also, for those of you from BC, predicted that Jim Sinclair wouldn't win when he ran for president of the BC Fed 11 or 12 years ago. He mentioned that yesterday. But the other thing that Michael Smith said when we were sort of dealing with the Q&A is that Christy Clark, our current premier, now wants to make peace with teachers. She wants a 10-year deal. Everything's on the table. Essential services is on the table, class size and composition is on the table, bargaining structure is on the table. The only thing that isn't on the table, he says, is standardized testing. How stupid can you be? But anyway, never mind. But everything's on the table. I want a 10-year deal with teachers. I want peace with teachers. And so someone asked him why. Why does she want peace with teachers now? Christy Clark is 30% behind Adrian Dix among women voters in this province. And Michael Smith has heard from Liberal insiders that one of the reasons she's so far behind with Liberal voters is that, with women voters, is that women don't like the way she treats teachers. That's the Liberal current analysis, and Michael Smith says that's the reason she wants peace with teachers. Now, my God, too bad we don't have special needs support, because it took her a long time to learn that lesson, I have to say. I could have told her that, you know. Actually, you know, teachers, you go out and talk to teachers and they think everybody hates them. And I keep telling them, no, no, you're wrong. Most people really like you. Most people have a pretty positive view of teachers. But anyway, I thought that was a really kind of interesting end to the 11-year story of teachers, that now she's figured out that you can't keep bashing teachers and keep public opinion on your side. It's an important lesson for politicians to learn. I want to just finish by saying something about our commitment as workers and as unions to sinking the Harper Agenda, fighting austerity, fighting for the things we believe in. Because I want to tell you that we are with you. We are with you, Robert, John, Linda, everybody, Maud, with the Council of Canadians. Many of us are members anyway, but this is something we're going to have to take on together. Unions can be very useful in that regard. We know how to fight for our rights. We're persistent as hell. We have resources. We know how to organize. And we believe in the things that most Canadians believe in, that we should be equal, that we shouldn't have poverty and homelessness, that we can afford health care and education, that we can afford to look after each other, and that we should tax people fairly and share that income. The best way to fight inequality is a fair tax system, is taxing corporations and taxing us all. And you know, I just want to finish with 2 thoughts. One of the things I really worry about is that when we get a right-wing government, they are so bloody bold when they get elected. They do everything the first day, you know, the first year, the first hour, and they attack us so vigorously. And it takes us a long time to get rid of them. But we're going to get rid of these Liberals next May. Absolutely. But, and I'm totally involved in the NDP, we're going to elect an NDP with a modest agenda. you know, with a modest agenda. And so a modest agenda, they're going to talk about their agenda being a modest agenda. You know, they're not going to put the 25% income tax back up, income, you know, they think they can't and still get elected. So my point is that the right is so bold when they get elected, and the left is, you know, a bit timid when they get elected, you know, too timid. And so I think we have to be bolder. I think we have to be bolder in our actions. And I think we have to create the public space and the public debate and the public support so that when we elect the left, they can be bolder. Which we can. So let's work on that. Let's stick together for it.